glace se répète par terre. La foule sort, se disperse. Restent deux femmes et un parapluie.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Poetry to Your Ears podcast. Today we're here with Heather. Heather is a poet and a writer based in Brighton. She speaks of wild and divine feminine archetypes, the primordial natural world, and the bittersweetness of being human. She is published in No Ordinary Words, The Real-Life Wisdom of Women, a book written by 33 women and edited by Kelly Herrick. She publishes her poems on the website Sprigs of Heather and on Instagram at Sprigs of Heather. So
Great.
check her out.
Is that a good bio?
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. So cute.
Maybe we can start off with a little question about yourself. When did you start writing poetry or prose?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like ever since I was a young girl, I always knew that I liked poetry and liked writing it, but I feel like I didn't really have, I wasn't so open to being creative when I was younger. I had a lot of anxiety and shyness, and I never really wrote poetry. But the moments that I decided to write poetry, I was always very I could do this. This is really nice, actually. I really like it. But I don't have a lot of people around me who would support me to do it. So when I first started writing poetry, I guess properly, was when I was 22. So just over 2 years ago. And it felt like a very, because I'm a spiritual person, so I like to see kind of things happening in my life, happening for a reason. And I feel like I'd just gone through, I wouldn't say it was a breakup because we were never together, but I really liked this person, basically. And, I was kind of pursuing him and I was basically rejected. And I was just, obviously you experience all those sorts of emotions when you go through something like that. And I just felt, I just felt the impulse to write poetry. There was no one telling me to do it, or I just was I should just write something about it. So I went on my notes app on my phone. I just started writing about it, and then I just found that after that, I was so surprised at how healing it was, how much it made me feel not necessarily better, but I felt more at peace after writing about those sorts of
getting
things.
it out there into the world, kind of releasing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think shortly after that, I just kept pursuing that and kept getting inspired by other things in my life. So not necessarily just what was going on at the moment, heartbreak, but I started writing poetry about, I guess, my family or how I used to feel when I was younger. And then I started, getting very inspired by, the natural world and femininity and what that means to me. And then, I guess my poetry progressed from there. But I'd say I properly started writing poetry 2 years ago. Yeah.
Sounds almost like you can use poetry as a way of exploring your feelings about things like that.
Yeah, I definitely think so.
And so you have a poem. You picked a poem, Eloise, of Heather's that
This
you like.
is a surprise poem.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what it
poem
is.
that I picked is Wing Woman.
Ooh.
Do you want to give us a little backstory, or should I just start reading it?
The Wing Woman.
I think read it first, and then maybe
Okay.
Heather can
And then
share
we can
what
have
she
a
wants
discussion.
to about it.
So it's quite a long poem. I got it on
Yes.
your website.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's on Instagram as well.
No, I'd never
No,
put it on Instagram.
Just on the website.
I'm really impressed that you picked that one. I'm excited to talk about it.
So it's put together in 3 parts. Wing Woman. 1. The Crow. Crone, you flew down to the ground to meet me on the wing of a crow, and you told me to open my eyes. You cackled and crackled, you cursed, curt and croaked coarse, and I watched your feathers blacken. My soul saddened instinctively. Heather, you called. I delivered a warning, and I knew it was coming because I'd seen you around all the time. Black beady eyes prying open a beak, curving a call, a caveat, crying, trying to get my attention. But I'd rather not listen, and I averted my eyes, blind. So the next time, you brought murder of crows. Don't silence me, silly girl. I felt them peck on my flesh. Dead or alive, they taunted, haunted. You couldn't get more obvious, obstinate. 2. The owl. Crone, you came to me in the dead of night on the wing of an owl, and you told me to get wise. A gentler approach, I must admit. A soft purr. Tweet-oo-coo-wee. I stirred from my sleep, slumbered eyes and ears perked up to you, perched atop the roof of my house, and I saw you, now, night vision. And your call was getting louder, but was I ready to listen? Heather, you crooned. I deliver a warning. And I knew it was coming because I see it now, cut through the nightlife of a knife, crystal clear. Yet, with eyes widened, I still could not bear to hear your wise words of warning. Instead, fawning, frozen in fear, capsizing, falling upon deaf ears, deafened. Death's the end, Heather. Nighty-night. I felt the crow crawled up my skin against the following morning. Good grief. 3. The garden bird. Crone, you came crashing and thrashing into me on the wing of a garden bird, and you told me I was going to die. And you realized I'd only open my eyes if you too made that sacrifice, that I'd only get wise if you too shared that same fate, so that day you flew straight through my open window. We both panicked at the absurdity of it all. Dear bird, you belong in the sky. How terrifying it must have been to die in a world so strange. Time to get brave. Dead for days, I found you later, hidden behind the dishes. Fucking frenetic, ripped my heart open, rippled the fright of our tenfold. Jesus Christ. Tearful and fearful, I laid your lifeless form to rest, and I could barely look at you. I'm so sorry. Or hold you in my hands, but I had to, this time. And I couldn't hear you anymore, but I didn't need to, this time. Because your omen of death was delivered straight to my doorstep, too close to home. Yes, you'd shown me that what happens to trapped birds, and as one myself, I couldn't ignore your prophecy of what was coming to me soon. The crows croaked and the owl never came back. I died later that week, shattered on impact. I'm still retrieving the bones. Epilogue, the great tit. But what was most twisted about all this was that the garden bird was a great tit. No, not a giant idiot, it's just the name of the bird. But I suppose it did fly, willingly and foolishly, into a home that was not its own. And finding the cage door closed, it flapped furiously with fright and flight, tried with all its tiny wing-beating might to flee, but ultimately sealed its fate, delivered as prey when the bird broke its neck in its bid to escape. Oh, crone, you have wings and a wicked sense of humor.
Oh, wow.
It's incredible. This is the first time I've heard this poem, and just like you say at the end there, you know it's dark and it has a wicked sense of humor in this poem as well. I mean, maybe it's strange for me to comment that, but I find a lot of humor in that poem, and a lot of heartbreak, and a lot of beauty, and a lot of darkness, and also a strange kind of hope and optimism in there as well.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it's a long poem. You said it was a long poem,
Yeah.
and I was reticent, but it didn't feel long to me when you were reading it just now.
Did you feel captivated in the
Yeah,
story?
absolutely. I really like it.
How is it to
Yeah.
hear your poem in the voice of someone else?
It's incredible, and I think you read it extremely well. And I feel like it's one of these poems that I've never actually read it out to anyone.
Okay.
And it's one of those things where, like, yeah, the way that I don't know, I think you just read it so incredibly. Like, I'm really inspired actually by how you read it.
I would imagine the experience of someone else reading my work to me would be kind of like frustrating. You feel like, they're kind of emphasizing the wrong part. Saying but
and of course my accent, some words I didn't even know if that's how you say them in English, but I was like, okay, whatever.
You missed caveat, but I think apart from that, it was pretty good.
Yeah, you did really well. And I think you were able to communicate the essence of it really well. I think you were able to take on like the voice of the crone.
Yeah, I was feeling like I was in the forest.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah. It's got a very Halloween witchy vibe. Yeah. It's like almost like a grim story.
It is.
You know? And I really like all the alliterations. I think the they really make you feel the sounds. It's a really great poem. I really love it.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah.
What was some of the inspiration?
So I think first of all I talk about how in my bio I'm really happy because I think this poem like sums up, you know, my little description, what I've written for myself. I must say it's so hard to write about what I write about. It's so hard to have that bird's eye view and be like, okay, this is what I write about. But yeah, so obviously a huge inspiration from nature because the whole poem it's about me, but like the birds have been an inspiration of me to sort of, I guess, like project my feelings onto them or like how I identify them. So yeah, the natural world and birds especially. I'm obsessed with birds. I'm always identifying with birds. I've written a lot of songs that are inspired by birds, and I identify with them because they're these beings, these creatures that are of the earth, but they're able to fly and they're able to sort of kind of guess transcend the sort of earthly realm, but they can never get to heaven. Like this sort of thing. Do you know what I mean? Like they're kind of they're bound to the earth, but they're able to fly, and I feel like I really relate to that and how delicate and ephemeral they are. And obviously the natural world and birds were a big inspiration for me. And so the way that the poem's structured is that I'm talking to the crone, and the crone is appearing in these birds, and the crone is a feminine archetype that I really identify with. So one of my greatest inspirations is in paganism they call it the triple goddess, which are these three archetypes of a woman, they say, called the maiden, the mother, and the crone. And they're meant to identify the different stages of a woman's life. So maiden is obviously the early stage, mother is the mid stage, not necessarily having a child, but like the mid stage of life. And crone is like the late stage of life. And crone is obviously, I don't know, I really like the word crone, but I feel like it's quite a contentious term. Like a lot of people think it's an insult, like the word hag or the word witch. Like for me, it's not an insult at all, but like a lot of people kind of see these as insults. Like if you're a crone, like you're old and like gnarly and like decrepit and all of these things. But like I'm a young woman, but like I actively embrace that sort of energy in my life. And it's so weird. Like the poem that I picked to read out is called Crone. Can you believe that? That's so funny. Like that's a huge crone energy. And I think for me, the crone. So basically, the poem is about me like not owning up to something, and the crone is appearing in these birds to try and get me to like open my eyes to admit what's going on in my life, something that is very dark. That's why the poem is extremely dark, because the subject matter was very dark. It was a really unhealthy relationship that ended really, really badly, and that's sort of how the poem ends with this with how it ends when I was like, I died later that week, shattered on impact, I'm still retrieving the bones. Like obviously I didn't die, but there was it's metaphorical for like an ending, a really significant and
maybe your relationship dying.
The relationship dying and a part of me dying too. And then the crone, the reason why I picked the crone is because the crone is the archetype of wisdom. So she's the one who can see that I'm not owning up to this. Like I'm continuing to choose to be in this relationship. Well, it's more nuanced than that, but I was avoiding something that I had to own up to. And she's the one who has wisdom, and she has the all-seeing eye, and she's trying to say like, look, this is what's going on, like coming down in all these signs. You know what I mean? Because the crow obviously is associated with death, like the black, a black bird. I don't know if you know the book Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. I'd really recommend it. It's kind of like an experimental prose poetry book about grief, and it uses a crow as its inspiration. So obviously the crow is kind of the omen of death and darkness, and then the owl is the being of the night that's wise, and it's more gentle, but it's still a bird of prey, you know, it's still a predator. And then obviously the garden bird was more innocent, and that... do you want to ask a question? Because I'd love to talk about that section about the garden bird.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, shall I just talk about it now, or...?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the way that the poem is set in 3 sections. So the first one is the crow, the second one is the owl, and both of them are similar, that they're trying to draw my attention towards something, but like, I have a lot of fear and I'm not owning up to it. And there's all these sorts of asides throughout the poem, you know, like good grief, like all of these sorts of things that like are drawing towards, that knowing that something dark is going on, but like not really wanting to open up to it. And then the garden bird section is different, because that's actually what happened to me in real life. So I can't remember what it says now, but it's like you came down to me, or like you crashed into me, like you flew through my open window, and like I found you dead behind the dishes. Like that literally happened to me. Like I'd gone for a walk, opened my window because it was a hot day, not thinking, like it wasn't like a huge window. Like I still find it crazy that a bird managed to fly through the window into my house. But it did. I got back and I opened the door and it was flying about frantically. I was like, oh my God, like so stressful, obviously. And I was like, shit, like I opened the door, like opened up all the windows. And then, you know, after a minute or so, it wasn't there anymore. So I presumed it had flown out.
Yeah.
And then, days later, I found it dead behind the dishes.
Oh my God.
It was awful. It was so
That's such an
traumatizing.
interesting, image.
So stressful.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where like it had flown into the closed window, and it would have broken its neck, because obviously like maybe it couldn't perceive that it was closed, you know, because it was transparent. And that was literally just a few days before the breakup, literally. Because when that happened, in that poem I said, something like, you knew that I would only own up to it if you shared the same fate as I did. And I know what happens to trapped birds, and as one myself, I knew the fate that was coming soon, and like your omen of death was delivered to my doorstep. And that was really significant. Like, it's really, really dark sense of humor, but like in hindsight after that, I was like, that would make a really good poem because it's literally poetry in real life.
Yeah.
But this is what I wanted to ask you. So I'm always interested how many sessions people write a poem in, and so this seems to me like you kind of built this in multiple writings rather than you sat down and wrote it all in one go.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, it was definitely the case. Like, the weird thing is I wrote this poem in a very different way to how I usually write poetry, because usually it's normally kind of, if not just one sitting, like I do the main bit in one go, like that sort of outpouring of emotion, and then I might come back to it and then like do a little bit of editing. But this one, I kind of knew what I wanted to say. Like I knew, it's funny, like the ending line, "Oh crone, you have wings and a wicked sense of humour." Like I think I came up with that first, like because I was thinking about the experience of what happened to me and the bird and how I related that to my own experience, and enough time had passed for me to sort of see
And to find it funny.
To find it funny and to find it be like, oh my God, like what I went through was so awful and terrible, but now that I'm out of it, I can kind of see like the sort of the dark humour in it all.
So this is. So do you kind of go through life looking for things that might make good poems, things that might make good lines? Is your mind geared in that direction of being sensitive to subjects that may make good poetry?
Yeah, I'd say I don't know. I feel like lately in my life, everything has been quite smooth sailing, touch wood. So lately, I haven't really been like, oh, that would make a good poem. But sometimes I do kind of come up with little lines in my head that are inspired, not necessarily by events, but like maybe feelings that I felt, or like, more just like, less events, but more how I feel about something. And then if I really like it, then I'll jot it down, and then it might be the inspiration for something, like this one was. But a lot of the time it's not necessarily like that.
The way it's laid out is very specific as well, right? Like it's clear to me that you've put a lot of thought behind how you've presented it. You know, like for example, the color of the page and the way you've laid the text out. And I know when I write, when I do a little bit of experimentation with laying text out, I am really super carefully thinking about how someone's processing that. If I'm going out of the norm. So, and it's when someone reads it, it's a different experience than if you yourself read it out loud. And what's your preferred way of people experiencing your poetry?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like initially it was always to be read, and I feel like it's still like that now. But I have started to write things more with like a speaking voice in my head, that is more meant to be experienced, being listened to, and I feel like it's kind of a bit of both. Like the way that I don't know how to describe it. Like I feel like when I'm writing poetry, I'm like I'm saying it in my head. Like the way that I come up with poetry, it's like it's coming from me and it's coming out as my voice, but I'm writing it down and want it to be read. But that being said, because I've sort of spoken it in my head first, if I read it out, it would have a similar. It would still work. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that makes sense to me.
But in your mind, the voice is always of Heather. For example, you don't write as other characters, or
I feel like, I don't know, it's weird. I feel like sometimes the way that I like to see it is that I channel, or like I take on the energy. So for example, in this poem, when I'm like, crone, you did this or that, and then like I'm hearing what she's saying, it's not necessarily always me, because not all of my poetry is about I did this, I did that. Sometimes it's more descriptive, but I don't know, I feel like there is, I think I think it's one of these things where like if you read a poem or listen to a poem, I always want people to know that I've written it. Like there's a certain way that I write and speak that I want to kind of keep.
Is it that you're talking to yourself with the voice of the crone?
Yeah, that sort of thing. So sometimes I actually do this as like a journaling practice, or like a self-help. Self-help is not the word, but sometimes like I'll write to myself, because I really identify with different archetypes, because I think one thing that I've struggled with growing up is I couldn't decide who I was. Like I felt like I had so many conflicting sides of myself. Like there was a side of me that was very like innocent and like naive and like playful and joyful, but then there was a part of me that had like a really wicked sense of humor and was quite dark, and I couldn't decide who I was, and I thought these were all at odds with one another. But like working with archetypes is this sort of idea that we have all of this within us. So that's why it inspires me with my poetry. So sometimes I even write to myself in the voice of a different archetype. So like from my inner witch, or like my inner warrior, or this sort of thing.
Almost like tarot cards.
Yeah, I really love tarot cards. Yeah, all this sort of thing. It's
What I really like in it is that you use images that are kind of universal, like the crow and the owl and the bird, like the garden bird. I feel like there's a common imagery as to what they represent. And we can all understand. But there's also the kind of subculture, like pagan witch subculture, which is more niche, but it also draws on that kind of more widespread culture, and it's really great how you use all these different images and the dialogue with each other.
Thank you. That's such a really wonderful way of expressing that. I think that's why I really love talking about nature, because it is so accessible. Like, literally, we live on Earth, so Earth is the most accessible thing to everyone. So kind of using that as a vehicle to maybe talk about more niche things or specific things. It's a way of like being accessible and kind of maybe shining a light on something that people may have not thought about before or seen in that way, but still it being familiar enough for them to grasp it.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I feel like if I just wrote poetry that was just completely pagan, a lot of people who weren't into that would be completely confused and be like, well, what's this about? But I really want to make it accessible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. Nature is really accessible. You can talk about all the elements and everyone relates to the wind. I don't know.
I'm really fascinated now to hear the poem that you've chosen.
Yes.
Today.
Oh,
since that it dovetails into
literally so well. Thank you.
This is all a big conversation about the crown.
Yeah. It's incredible how that's worked out. Let me just get it up on my phone. So, yes. This is probably my favourite poem that I've ever written. And it's actually it's actually a set of three, similarly to this one. It's divided into three. But
it's actually the same poem.
But the thing is, so this poem is called Maiden, Mother, Crone. So it's a set of three poems, Maiden, Mother and Crone. Okay. But they do exist as standalone poems in my eyes. But interestingly enough, the crone part of the poem is the only one that I've ever used as a standalone poem, if that makes sense. Normally I like to kind of do it as three, but I feel like the crone one, I don't know, I think it's just my favourite one. And yeah.
You're going to read everything, right?
I'm just going to read the crone one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's part of a trilogy. It's part of a free. Okay, great.
Yeah. I mean, I could read all of it, but I don't know how much time we have. Do you think it'll go if I just...
How long is it?
It's
about roughly
36 lines. I think it would take about 3.5-4 minutes.
Yeah, read everything.
You want me to read everything?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So this is Maiden, Mother, Crone. Maiden. Sweet maiden of the land, her beauty sings like the birds. You'll find her amongst flowers. Generous and gentle, she unfurls her petals, and as she blossoms, the earth flourishes. Fruitful and in her youth, the hills swell with her soft curves, and her delicate features frame the red sky at night, and oh, how the shepherds delight. But man decides to bleed her dry, there on her flower bed. He takes her, he ravages and disparages her. He takes, and he takes, and he takes. And now her soil, once so fertile and fresh, is left barren, bereft, spent. Now, with no fruit left to bear, man seems not to care, and takes himself elsewhere, for another maiden to violate. I weep for you, sweet maiden. Man's taken advantage of you. But now we know why the rose grew her thorns. Mother. Dearest mother, life-giver, her bubbling wellsprings spill into vast oceans and spans the earth. Creates, cultivates, nurtures, grows, provides home. O Mother Earth, from birth you have breathed the life into our lungs, and the first birds sung in jubilation. But man, disgraced and in hubris, flies the nest straight into the sun. Uprooted from the ground that grew him, he severs our ties with nature. So we begin to unravel. Loose threads fray, and in the frailty of man's ego, he rejects where we're from. We've declared ourselves orphans, but man does not mourn. Yet our mother looks on, and the tears for her lost sons and daughters fill waterfalls, rivers burst their banks, and man still doesn't seem to understand that this cut runs deep enough to drown us. I'm so sorry, dearest mother. We've committed the most inconceivable betrayal of all. But now we know why she sends us storms. Crone. Oh, wise crone, you've grown with the mountains, and like them, you're immovable. Steadfast, you amassed your wisdom over many years, and the birds crane their necks to hear your words, spoken between the trees, and the oak agrees, a sage himself, that we should pay heed her wisdom. But man does not listen, and so will never learn. Instead will burn ablaze in man's crazed pursuit of reason. He thinks he has the key, but the answers we need are not found in our heads, but by our feet. In the resilience of rocks, the rootedness of trees. Oh, but we wouldn't believe it. So man climbs the mountain to curse the crone that knows more than he ever dare admit, and swipes her seat at the summit of creation. But erupting now in volcanic rage, the wise crone seethes rapid flames to scorch our arrogance to ashes. Finally, in the fire, we feel her scorn. Thank you.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about, obviously you've chosen this man, and it's kind of, it's kind of like a double thing where it's like you're talking about the arrogance of men traditionally, but it's also you're kind of winking at this term of man being used for humankind.
Yeah.
You kind of
exactly,
it's like
yeah.
a kind of so yeah, I mean it's just an observation, I suppose. It's interesting. You're kind of expressing frustration in that way, right?
Yeah.
To what extent do you use kind of the description of these archetypes in paganism compared to maybe your own imagination of these archetypes?
What do you mean by that? Sorry.
Well, this kind of common, like an archetype has this kind of common description and imagery, and then there's what you make of it and how you appropriate it yourself.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I feel like in this poem itself, it's definitely linked to personal experience. So with the maiden, I've talked about how she's sexually taken advantage of. The mother, she's not appreciated for everything that she does, and the crone is not listened to for the wisdom that she has. And those are personal experiences, but I know they're not universal, perhaps that's not the right word, but they're collective experiences of young girls, women, people who identify towards the feminine. So for me, I have this idea of what the maiden, the mother, the crone are, like, for the wisdom that you read in books and how people talk about it. But the way that they're expressed in this poem, it is definitely, as you said, it was a vehicle for me to express the frustration that I personally had. So yeah, there's a lot of me in that poem. But I really wanted to write a poem that was, as you said, like, talks about man. But for me, because I've written it and I've read it so many times, for me, it's not about men anymore. It's about humanity. And that's why I really, really liked that. I thought it was really clever how I talked about man does this, man does that. And depending on sort of maybe what's on your mind right now or where you are in your life, like you might either perceive that as a feminist issue, like, okay, so men are doing this to women, or like, it's more nuanced than that, but like this is a sort of toxic masculinity that we're suffering from. Or like if you're kind of seeing it from more an ecological perspective, then you're like, okay, so this is what humanity is doing. Like humanity is pillaging the world of the resources. It's not appreciating that this is the home that we have, and it's not appreciating the wisdom of the cycles of the earth. So for me right now, the way that I perceive the poem, I see it as a ecological issue. But when I wrote it, I was definitely I definitely was. It was more of a feminist thing,
Mm.
and it felt like the wisdom of the earth was sort of speaking through me. Like I didn't consciously want to write that.
Yeah. Are they mutually exclusive though? Can you have an ecofeminist
Oh.
interpretation of it?
Yeah. Well, no, they're not mutually exclusive at all. I think ideally I would really love it to be perceived completely in an eco-feminist way. But I feel like,
Mm.
yeah.
Do you ever write about your own kind of masculine energies? Because I feel like the way you talk about femininity is more in this kind of energy that is in everyone,
Yeah.
that doesn't depend on people's gender.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But equally, there's the kind of masculine energy. Do you ever write about that?
Yeah, I've actually started to. I have written recently on the masculine energy, and yeah, yeah, as you said, like for me, it's not about womanhood; it's about femininity, and I really do believe that it is accessible in every single person. But obviously, like for me as a woman, I really like these more. I like every. Do you know what I mean? Like for example, the word lover or warrior, or like even witch, like these names, they're not necessarily gendered, but also at the same time I really like things like maiden or mother that are more connected to womanhood. I don't know, I am a woman, but I'm a very fluid person, and I definitely identify with all of this energy. For me, I'm more inspired by femininity, I think also for me to help me embrace my femininity more. That's why I write a lot about it and not so much about masculinity, but I am also interested in it, and I have started writing about it recently. Yeah.
Exciting.
I know. maybe I'll write a poem called like Warlock or something. Or like, I don't know what the masculine equivalent
I
of.
feel like it would do like a good poetry collection.
Yeah.
Like femininity, masculinity. It's like in 2 parts. Food for thought.
Yeah, food for thought.
Do you want to talk to us about your book that you've been published in?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, tell us all about it. Excited.
Yeah. So it's how it started is that I was involved. So there's a UK charity called Tree Sisters, and it's an amazing charity that it champions like women's leadership and the reforestation of the earth. So they raise money to plant trees basically, and they've planted like millions of trees, which is amazing. And they're a really cool company, and they do things in a really different way. And it's very, very humble, and it's very people focused and community focused. Like it's not like, oh, we're this amazing charity that plants lots of trees, give money to us. It's like we're all in this together. We're just kind of like the initiator, but we're all tree sisters or tree brothers or tree siblings. Do you know what I mean? We're all connected to the earth. And then there was a creative. They do courses, online courses, and they have online communities, and they do this thing called. I'd really recommend if this is what you're interested in. They have a course that they run seasonally, called "Liberating Our Creative Voice for the Earth." And you know, as you've heard from all my poetry, I'm very inspired by the earth, and you know, that's kind of why I write for. Like I write for the healing of humanity and the earth. So I got involved in the course that they ran, and it basically is just like a set of Zoom calls where we do creative things together. But it's also an online community where people who have creative ideas and are looking for collaboration, they can start that sort of thing. So that's how it started. The woman who published it, called Kerry Herrick, she basically said, I want to create this book that shares the wisdom of women, and I want it to be this sort of, the ethos was that like every woman has a story to share. Like, you know, because we live in a celebrity culture, don't we? Where like we really like idolize these people who've
only
done
a few
this.
People have a story.
Absolutely. There's only the certain few, blah blah blah. Like, but she was like, every person has a story, and I think that's why it's called No Ordinary Words. Like, I think she wanted to include the word ordinary and to be like every single person, not just women, but like every single person has a story. And we're all extraordinary in our own way, like, you know what I mean? It's really humble. So basically she said, yeah, I really want to start this book. I can't do it by myself. I want people to be involved. And I heard the call for this in October. just before I moved to Brighton, actually.
Where were
And
you in before?
I was living in my parents' house where I grew up in a place called Filey in North Yorkshire. I don't know if you know where that is. It's by the sea,
Okay.
up north. And yeah, so as soon as I saw that, it was one of those things where I don't know if you experienced this, but like my conscious mind wasn't working at all. Like, because if it was, I would have been like, oh, like this is scary. Like, oh, I don't know if I'm ready to share my words. But there was a part of me that was like, this is the perfect opportunity. Like, you have to do this. Do you know what I mean? Because, you know, I'm also writing a book at the moment. And, you know, I'm hoping in the future, I want it to be published by an agent, or I might do it myself. But I knew...
It's a book of poetry?
No, it's how do I describe it? It has lots of styles in it. There's poetry in it, but it's more of a non-fiction philosophical book that kind of is about everything that I've talked about today, about like femininity in the earth. But because that's my goal, to be like an author of books, I thought this is a fantastic opportunity to be published for the very first time in a book. You know, it doesn't require me sending emails to people being like, do you want to publish me? It literally was someone inviting me, being like, you know, if you fit the criteria, if you've got wisdom to share, if you align to this ethos, then come join us. So that was great. And then I said, yes, I'll do it. And they were like, cool, we'd love to have you on board. And I joined very close to the draft deadline. The draft deadline was Halloween. So it was literally just under a month for me to write my chapter. And they said about 1,500 words. And obviously they had a folder where other women had uploaded what they'd written. So I got to have a sense of what people had written about. And even though it was made in the context of this, you know, wisdom of women and the earth, like she specifically said, like, it doesn't have to be about these things. It could be about any sort of life experience. Like, what she really wanted was just to shine a light on, the stories of women, like whatever they are. And under the idea that if, you know, other people could read it, regardless of your gender, and like relate to it, or like maybe get an insight or feel solidarity and knowing that someone else has gone through the same thing, or inspiration. So
What did you write about?
Here we go. So it won't surprise you to know that the title of my chapter was a feminine archetype, and it was called Maiden. And it's so funny, like I had this sense of feeling within me saying it should be called Maiden. And I didn't know why. It's the same feeling I had when it was like, you should write poetry. It's like, I don't know where this is coming from. And I was procrastinating for so long, and I was like, how am I going to write this? I don't know what to write about. I just sat down one day and I just started writing. And then I was writing for about 40 minutes and I had written it. It sort of happened like that. I was flooded. I was like, oh God, I don't know what to write about. I don't know how to write it. Like, should I plan it? Should I think about it first? It's just one of those things where like the moment aligned and I just wrote it. And basically it's a memoir, basically. It's a memoir of my life so far. And quite significantly, the past year of my life, when I wrote it, so the past year and a half, was a huge significant turning point in my life. And that's what the poem, like Wing Woman, was about, the turning point of this really terrible relationship and the breakup, and how that really forced me to turn my life around.
So where can people find this book? Where can people read it?
Amazing. So it's published on Amazon. So if you type into Amazon, No Ordinary Words, it should come up. But also,
it's like in Kindle or published.
So you can buy it on Kindle, but it's also a physical copy that you can buy. So you can have a look on Amazon, but also on my Instagram, I have a link, and you can click on it and buy it there.
How do you see the future for Sprigs of Heather?
Oh, wonderful. Oh, so how Lulu and I met. Like, I started going to more spoken word events last month. I did my first poetry reading, spoken words, in November, and that felt more for me like less. I'm a poet and want to speak on stage.
A Words by the Water,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, it was a Words by the Water.
That we've talked a lot on the show.
yeah. I feel like for me I was less concerned about being a visible poet, but more concerned of what I actually read, like I really wanted to say it. Do you know what I mean? It felt like I had to say it, to say it to people. It's like it was really powerful. But then recently I've been like, you know, I want to know more poets. I want to become more visible in Brighton as a poet. So I have started going to more spoken word nights. I've only gone to like say 3 since then, but for me that's more. So for me, I just want to keep speaking at more poetry and spoken word nights, keep writing, challenge myself with my poetry to write, I guess, more spoken word things, I would say, because I had a lot of resistance towards that for a while. And if it's anything that I know, it's that if I have a resistance towards something, it's always something that I think I should do, or like at least try out. And just keep speaking. And after the publication of this book, being part of a book like that's how I would like to continue. So I don't know how far in the future, because I'm still writing this book at the moment, but I do want to have this published, and I do want people to read it. Yeah, that's the grand future.
Great, we wish you all the luck for the future, and hopefully you'll be back on the show talking about all your achievements.
Thank you.
Thank you for talking to us. That was a great pleasure.
Thank you for coming today. Yeah,
we'll see you at Poetry Open Mics in Brighton, and hopefully in a new book.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Great.
Je regarde de l'autre côté de la rue. Mon regard est accroché par des vagues qui discutent sous la pluie. Je dois être excité. Oui, mais